We're here today to share the stories of our Collegiate Mental Health Innovation Council members. CMHIC is dedicated to finding and highlighting student leaders who filled gaps in traditional supports and services on their campus. Stay tuned to hear their stories and their programs in their own words.
Hi everyone, I'm here today with Kat Wang, a member of our CMHIC cohort for 2018-2019. We're going to talk about all of the awesome things that she's been working on at UCLA. So Kat is a rising junior and she is studying political science with a minor in global studies at UCLA. She worked as part of their Depression Grand Challenge as a member of their Resilience Peer Network that supported other students in a number of ways, bringing in elements of mindfulness, CBT, and group support. And a really awesome thing that she shared with us through the council is her work on Joelle Bruin, a holistic mental health chatbot for UCLA students that consolidates resources, offers basic counseling, and provides emergency contact information. And she spent the past year studying it, and they're going to do a relaunch based on the things that they've learned in the fall. So with that background information, I wanted to turn it over to Kat to share a little bit about her interest in mental health and how she got to doing all of the really great stuff she's doing at UCLA.
Sure. Hi. It's great to be talking today. Yeah. Okay, so to share a bit about Joelle Bruin. The idea for Joelle Bruin that I had came about when I entered UCLA as a freshman, I found it very difficult to figure out what kind of mental health resources were on the map at UCLA. For instance, CAPS, the Counseling and Psychological Services Department at UCLA, is the most prominent source of support and counseling in terms of mental health for students. But I didn't know much about what kind of student orgs there were or what kind of services off campus that UCLA supported for students. And I had to find out a lot of these things by myself and by consulting my peers. And I thought, what if there was a way to consolidate all this information from varied sources and make it very simple for students to find what they need on such a large campus with a large student body? So Joelle Bruin basically is a chatbot that students can interact with in basic conversation to learn more about the exact type of resources that they have access to, how to go about finding them, and in the end, contact points for more information that they might need. On top of that, Joelle Bruin also offers basic mental health tips and advice based on conversation prompts, and as an additional service, it offers reference information for crisis hotlines in cases of emergency. Of course, we're working on expanding the services that Joelle Bruin provides, and that's the reason why we are taking Joelle Bruin down over this summer so that we can relaunch it this fall.
So I guess what were some of the things that you found out about the chatbot this past year, and maybe address some of the topics and questions that you get from people who don't necessarily have a tech background or who would be interested in doing something similar?
Definitely. So some of the things that we learned over the past year, well, specifically 2 active quarters of running Joelle Bruin, is that in terms of making a chatbot very interactive and intuitive, it takes a lot of planning in terms of thinking about the terms people are most likely to use when searching for information, and that takes a certain level of research about the sort of language that people use when trying to approach mental health resources. For instance, when someone types, "I'm feeling sad, what can I do?" into Joelle Bruin in the text entry, we need to understand more about the situation, and for that, Joelle needs to ask more questions, and then from there, see what the user says in response. For instance, "I'm feeling sad. Can you tell me more about this?" Joelle may respond, and the user may say, I'm feeling like I'm really stressed and I don't know how to cope with all my schoolwork. In response, Joelle may refer the user to a guide on specific time management tips. Joelle may refer the student to the academic support program at UCLA with, the contact person and the website with all the specific details of the program. And this way, the user can get the most accurate information that's relevant to their situation. For people who are interested in starting a similar sort of chatbot, I'd say it's very important to understand what exactly a chatbot is, just because chatbots, because they're linked to AI, are tools that people often think are either extremely advanced or extremely useless. When we think of artificial intelligence, it's easy to picture the sort of dystopian robots that take over the world, or things that just completely don't work. For instance, we may all have experiences with Siri or the Google voice assistant that just simply go kaput. Chatbots specifically refer to conversational AI agents that help achieve very specific ends. They rely on processing specific terms in the user's input to perform simple commands. And Joelle in particular just relies on searching for terms or relying on the user's prompts to come up with responses in forms of messages. Joelle doesn't really have the access to perform calendar changes or things like that. So it's very simple in terms of technology, and there are limits on what it can do in terms of identifying terms. But when it can work, it works very well. For instance, Joelle will not be able to distinguish in a sentence if you write both, I'm feeling really sad because my dog died, but now I'm feeling okay and I'm looking forward to the rest of the week. Joelle may flag the term sad and not register the rest of what you said about how your week is actually going in terms of everything else quite okay. So I'd say for people trying to start their own chatbot-like programs, it's important to also recognize that it can't do everything you might want it to. I definitely set out with the idealistic sort of notion that I could create through artificial intelligence something that can rival a human companion in terms of hearing out your problems and pointing out the best solution to them. But in terms of what it can do, Joelle Bruin just responds to specific terms and pulls out the most relevant response. I think another thing to be aware of, and it's true for any sort of mental health initiative that you, as a student, are interested in starting on your own campus, is that in terms of just scope and liability, chatbots can never truly, and when it comes to technology as a whole, chatbots can never truly replace human interaction, and as such can never be truly a counseling service in itself. And that's important to note in the language of your project. It's important to note in the aim that you set out to achieve, because chatbots, as I've mentioned, can be quite dumb, and at the end of the day, can never replace a good counselor or a good friend at a time of need. So I hope that sort of clears up some of the prevailing questions that might be surrounding starting a chatbot on campus, and I'm definitely open to discussing more.
Well, it sounds like this has been an extraordinary amount of work involved in training Joelle to flag certain words, understand how to respond to things, utilize different resources. I definitely understand why you got started, and I think every school in every community in every setting where people go could benefit from something like this, just to have one source that can refer you to more information that you can go to, that knows emergency resources and all of that. But practically, can you share a little bit about the support that you received from the university and how that side of things work, because I think conceptually these ideas are really important, but the bigger barrier, aside from understanding and knowing how to create a chatbot, is figuring out how to get support from the university and what that support looks like, and how that would cost, and how many people are involved. Can you talk a little bit more about the logistics sides of doing something like this?
Definitely. Logistically, you're right. In terms of executing such a chatbot, there's a lot of research and information collection that goes behind the scenes, and as such, it's not an individual effort. Joelle definitely started off just as me behind my laptop, sort of squeezing in hours of the day to work on the project. But as the scope of the chatbot broadened, so did the need for an actual team and support administratively. So the way I went about it was, first of all, to approach student-led initiatives. One resource I found very helpful was UCLA's Creative Labs, which is a student-led creative community that connects designers, managers, and developers to create projects that address issues in UCLA and the LA community at large. So I was able to seek out really highly skilled individuals through that group and build a team around that. We actually made a side project in addition to our work on Joelle Bruin called Collegiate, which was a gratitude journaling app for students at UCLA. And it's still running. It's a very simple journaling app that we found to be very popular amongst our peers. But when it came down to approaching the student government as well as other offices of the actual UCLA governing bodies, what I found most useful was approaching the actual research teams, the branches of research teams at UCLA, then going straight up to the administrators themselves and pitching this idea for a chatbot to help UCLA students. I made contact first with the Depression Grand Challenge team, and through them I was able to liaise with the actual student governors that oversaw project funding and all that. In the end, we were able to secure a very small grant, but given the size of our team and the fact this project wasn't, a long-term initiative, a decent amount of funding. I'm not sure about the privacy policies, if I can fully disclose them.
No worries, no worries.
It's a grand challenge, and it's like a scientific, it's a technological fund, but we were able to go through that route and get support for our project, seeing as how it was dedicated to the UCLA student body specifically. A tip that I would have for people trying to pitch their own technological applications of AI or data to mental health through any kind of university admin funding program. I would suggest, first and foremost, making it very clear that whatever you're proposing will not increase the liability the university would have toward the students, because what I found in my conversations with the representatives of these, higher up organs of the UCLA body, the governing body, is that their main concern is that with anything that involves mental health, increasing the risk that the student body is at, or providing services that fail to ultimately deliver on their promises in terms of being misleading in any way. For instance, a chatbot, if I pitched it in a way that sounded like this will counsel students, it would be an immediate no-no, because their concern would be, oh, if it doesn't work and a student ends up being at risk to themselves or to other students, it would come under the umbrella of this chatbot's responsibility, because if it promises to be able to care for students in a certain way and it doesn't end up following through, then it would be the chatbot's fault, and because it was supported by the university's fault, and there would be a whole tumbleweed of just legal issues involved. So in a nutshell, if you are approaching mental health with a technological perspective, make sure that it's easy for the administrators to understand that what you're building or what you're creating is going to help students in a way that doesn't make the university very liable or increase any risks.
Yeah, liability is definitely something that has come up for peer support, for kind of any new initiatives taken around campus mental health, just because, you know, we live in a society that likes lawsuits, and, you know, we want to make sure we protect everybody and support everybody to the best of our ability. So that's definitely something that comes up a lot as a topic. So other than learning what you've learned about the importance of navigating the liability and safety conversations with the university, were there any interesting things that came up during your test in this past year that you were going to be integrating into the launch in the fall, or is there anything you're hoping to learn this upcoming year?
Definitely. I think the most interesting thing that we learned from our testing process was that a lot of our users were very open and receptive to the chatbot being more than just a sort of database and recommendation tool. They were interested in really seeing the chatbot as a sort of, I hesitate to use the word, but friend in your pocket, because there's something very novel and I think very unique about having a chatbot that is there to help you at all times, 24/7, in your pocket, especially for, I suppose, to bring it back to the psychological tendencies of people of roughly my age, that digitally a persona that exists that can help you in your life, that makes things easier and really enriches your sort of college experience, not only through providing resources when necessary, but also just being a sort of, you know, AI toy that you can pull up and, you know, spend time with. Because through obviously our sort of you know, a privatized, not privatized, in our secure messaging platform, that we don't see the people's names, but we do get a sort of wide range of data about what's being said. We found, aside from being able to navigate resources, a lot of people just like talking to Joelle and just, you know, and just saying hi and like asking funny questions and just, you know, asking about, you know, are you a robot? Are you alive? And we had initially this program sort of stock funny responses to those questions that we thought people might ask, you know, as a whole. And it occurred to our team that, in a way, part of what Joelle could offer beyond mental health support in terms of providing resources was also just the feeling of being a little less lonely, because there was always someone that you could, someone or something technically, that you could interact with. And I think that's an interesting consideration, just having a chatbot as a tool, but also emphasizing its relative humanity and interactions. I think that's what we're definitely trying to add to Joelle going forward, on top of just enhancing the additional, you know, sort of resources that we want to make available. Also making sure that in terms of offering emergency services, we're not, you know, all the numbers are correct, you know, just and nothing's been outdated. Yeah, I think going forward, what I would definitely like to see more of in Joelle, and what I'm definitely going to try to implement, is just the ability to have a more seamless experience that doesn't involve as much button pushing, quite literally, because at least in Facebook Messenger, when you try to converse with the chatbot, more often than not, there are little prompts in the form of buttons at the bottom of the screen that really speed up the process, but also as a user, the feedback that we received about that was that it sort of takes away from the feeling that you're able to really tell your problem specifically and get an answer for that. It felt more like it was sort of just following a trail of stock FAQs. And I think to some degree they are still necessary to specify certain problems, but working on that will try to make certain terms even more, attached to responses, so it'll be easier for Joelle to really converse with the user.
I want to go back to what you mentioned about people just checking in with Joelle, because I talked to you a little bit earlier about being at an event that was focused on tech and mental health, and this idea of having kind of a friend in your pocket came up, and one of the questions was about, will this further the isolation that people are already experiencing? Because a lot of the data is showing that millennials and then Gen Z are the loneliest generations for probably a lot of complicated interacting reasons. I would assume that the AI probably isn't there yet to where it would be somebody you want to talk to all the time, but has the loneliness or isolation come up a lot in the data that you've collected, and do you think that there's any near future chance of something like this? I think maybe like 10 years from now, but do you think there's any chance of that increasing isolation, or how do you see this mediating or addressing that?
I definitely agree with your point that AI is right now nowhere near advanced enough to be able to hold a functioning conversation, for the main reason that memory retention for AI, memory for chatbots is incredibly difficult because it doesn't retain context for what you said previously. So for instance, if I'm conversing, at least with Joelle, if you're conversing with Joelle and say, I had a bad day today, Joelle will say, oh, what's wrong? And we might say, oh, what's wrong? We haven't added that, but hypothetically, right? Oh, what's wrong? The user then says, my cat was run over by a car, which is very tragic. And Joelle might say, if we train Joelle to be able to respond to identify that X object being run over by something else is not a good thing and pin that with something negative, Joelle may respond, I'm really sorry about that. I hope you're feeling okay. If later on in that same conversation, the user then says something else that requires Joelle to recall what was discussed previously, Joelle will not remember a single thing about the user being sad that their cat was killed. And it's that kind of thing that makes chatbots very difficult to converse with on a human level. And it's actually the very subject of that whole Turing test, when back in the early age of AI, to distinguish computers from humans. Generally, computers could not pass the Turing test at all, except in the one case where the computer was, the AI, the chatbot itself was meant to be an 8-year-old boy. I'd say that in terms of people of my generation feeling very isolated and lonely, I'd say interactions with chatbots are not, I'd say they're not the cause itself, but rather a reflection of the problem that perhaps millennials, because of social media, because of the greater sense that, perhaps the future is not reflecting what they want it to be, they turn to electronic interactions rather than human ones. I wouldn't say that just facing chatbots is the sole cause of this entire generation thing. But I do get how, to some, perhaps to some researchers or other individuals in the field, that the prospect of having a digital tool that could be a rival to human interaction, how this would be seen as a problem because of the existing trend of millennials only interacting with, millennials, just this generation, interacting with technology. To that, I would say, though, that chatbots don't replace human interaction. They only supplement it. And I think the reason why, at least for our data, we've seen a lot of people trying to converse and get to know Joelle is just the excitement, perhaps, the curiosity that goes into, I think, any sort of new technology when you're trying to figure out and explore what it can do, but also just the feeling that, you know, trying to figure out how human this is and interact with it accordingly. Whether or not it's fueling a deeper emotional need is hard to gauge. Mm-hmm. And I doubt that even if we were to conduct research surveys into the matter, few people would openly admit if they felt, you know, comforted by speaking to Joelle. But what we have noticed, though, is that this interaction is definitely present, and it does seem to be the trend that people are actively seeking Joelle as just something to, you know, something to talk to. Yeah, I hope that addresses what you asked, and of course, I'm more than happy to talk more about it. I'm just not sure if I'm straying too far from the initial conversation.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. There's a lot going on with mental health and technology, so I think that people have a lot of fears and excitement, and you kind of find people hang out really strongly in the fear or really strongly in the excitement.
Definitely.
So I think it's important to consider, you know, all the sides of things. But I would say, in terms of the folks who have used it so far, have you been able to tell in your data collection, are people using it repeatedly? Are people downloading it and saying, oh, this will help me get connected to campus, figure out where I can get therapy on campus, and then they don't use it anymore? Or do people kind of keep it and keep talking to it? Or is there kind of like different segments of folks who are interacting with it?
There are definitely different use cases that we've noticed. The first one, I think, is definitely what you just described, of someone opening Joelle, beginning the interaction, and then as soon as they find the resource, don't really return because they were successfully, you know, I guess, directed to what they needed. I think the second use case are just people who, I guess, because after they get directed to one resource, feel they're interested in finding out more. Often what we notice is that people, for instance, seek out some sort of institutional support, you know, through CAPS or the Bruin behavioral health support system. But on top of that, afterwards, come back to find out more about what else exists. Like, could this supplement what I'm looking for? Could this replace it? Or also look into student clubs about mental health that they might be interested in joining or contributing to. The third use case, I think, is just sort of the most erratic, that we've found it very difficult to sort of put a finger on. But I think it's best described as people who are just there to browse. They don't really complete a full, you know, for instance, if Joel's trying to ask them about what they need for certain resources, they just they either really poke around a lot, and there doesn't seem to be a very definite end where the interaction stops, as in they take the message and follow the link or follow the guide, they just keep looking and looking, and then poking around. I think some of these people are probably trying to see what exactly Joelle Bruin can do. Whether or not they are actually using these resources is hard to tell. There are also the people who just try to talk to Joelle. I think these are the people who are just curious, and they say things like, hello. And then, of course, we program responses that go, hi, how are you doing, and that kind of thing. But they don't seem to really, be serious. Of course, we had the trolls, but I just treat those, and I think our team, we just treat those as anomalies, because they're the people who just ask really weird or inappropriate questions, and our standard stock response that we've sort of given Joel is, I'm sorry, I don't have a response to that. Because things like, oh, can I marry you? It's like we haven't implemented case by case responses to questions like that.
Yeah.
But they definitely do exist. I think there's a whole branch of AI people that I think technically are classified as okay, no, that's something different. They're called obscene questions, but those I think refers explicitly to the people who are trying to vent out their sexual frustration or something on an AI bot. But that I think that as a whole, the 3 use cases that we've identified, I think capture the sort of people who have been using Joelle.
So in terms of connecting folks to community resources, so you connect them to the counseling center, you share about other mental health groups on campus, but obviously, a lot of people find support for their mental health through non-mental health resources. Are you kind of referring folks to anything that might exist on campus? And then the other part of my question is, are you also referring people to anything off campus?
Because of our sort of involvement with the Depression Grand Challenge, our main focus has been directing students to resources on campus, just because the focus is, in the end, about the UCLA community as a whole, and not trying to, I suppose, refer students to sources that are not within the greater umbrella of UCLA. Though, in terms of recommending other sort of clubs or activities or programs for students to partake in, our main focus still has been under the branch of mental health and mental health related activities, because it was sort of our intention that if students were able to sort of identify what their hobbies are through our tips or by themselves, then they would be able to sort of approach them separately. Also, because practically we didn't really want to include so much additional information in Joelle, and it would take so much longer to sort of comb through. Versus if they were interested in sports, we would then have to sort of initiate this entire other chain of, so what kind of sports are you interested in? UCLA offers varsity this or that, and yeah, that would sort of be another dimension of Joelle that we haven't really explored. But that's the main reason why so far we haven't included additional tracks for resources off campus or resources involving non-mental health related activities that could be used in a mental health setting.
Yeah, I think because it gets so hard you want to do everything for everybody, but you sometimes have to just be more specific about, this is what we're focusing on. And it sounds like with the tips and all those things, like it would be possible if somebody said, I feel lonely, or I don't have any friends, that you could tag those phrases and then link to tips about loneliness and link to, this is where a lot of people meet friends through student orgs. Like, here's the link to find all the student organizations and have it that way, as opposed to,
are you interested in art? And then art-related activities, and specifically branches of art activities. Yeah. The way that chatbots are generally structured is through a flowchart or like a tree diagram, and it shows all the different options that the user could possibly say, and then the different sort of responses cascading down based on the subsequent responses. And at the moment, Joelle's tree is sort of started off very simple, and now it's become this network of roots that if you don't sort of zoom in to read, it gets very like boggling, mind-boggling to look at. But yeah, I think that's definitely something that could be included, just not at its current state.
Yeah.
With our current team and the resources that we have.
So UCLA is actually pretty exceptional. I know every school has room to grow and improve, but in terms of the work that's being done on mental health and campus mental health specifically, and I guess when we're looking at the broader campus context, you know, you've been involved in other parts of the Depression Grand Challenge. Do you mind, for folks who are listening, talking a little bit about what that is and how your work has fit into all of the really cool things that are happening on that campus?
Definitely. UCLA's Depression Grand Challenge is, in essence, just a campus-wide initiative that spans both faculty and students to run programs that just address depression and mental health as a whole at UCLA. And what I've been involved in terms of the Depression Grand Challenge, Joelle aside, has been mainly the Resilience Peer Network, which is a training program that sort of teaches students at UCLA who sign up for the program basic skills of peer counseling that rely on meditation, mindfulness, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And in terms of what how Joelle has been sort of involved in the Depression Grand Challenge as a whole, Joelle at the moment, after pending its relaunch, will be sort of involved with the Outreach Peer Network, which is a sister organization of the Resilience Peer Network, that focuses on making students fully aware of the resources that UCLA has to offer in terms of mental health. And so, as you can imagine, Joelle fits pretty well into the aim of that org, and we're hoping to collaborate very.
But from your experience, what was your process like becoming part of the Resilience Peer Network and working in that role?
As part of the Resilience Peer Network, a lot of what I did was just assisting with the training programs that were offered to students in terms of peer training. And I think, personally, I learned a lot about not only what it takes to teach peer support skills, but also what it meant and what it means to be a peer supporting another. Previously, prior to joining UCLA, in high school at least, I was already quite an active mental health advocate, but I never approached the entire process specifically in terms of how to really, develop best practices for interacting with a peer who is in need of support. I understood it more generally in terms of being a good listener and being not being judgmental. But with Resilience Peer Network, I discovered that there were very concrete tools that could also be used when supporting a peer, and that these tools in particular, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, such as leading mindfulness tactics, that these tools could be used in a way that really enhanced the support that you could give as an individual. So on both fronts, as someone who helped develop training programs and as someone who herself is learning to become a peer counselor, I've gained a lot from Resilience Peer Network, and I hope to continue contributing to the programs because I really do believe that one of the strongest ways that a community can ensure that people are mentally healthy is by making sure that we can look out for one another as peers.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really great. And I think it is so important is that, you know, combining all of the different ways in which people want and need specialized supports, but I think at the core, people really just need to know that there's other people who will be there for them and who will listen to them and who can share tips and tools that worked for them, and, you know, they're not alone is as simple as it sounds, just like a transformational concept.
Definitely. I think what I've observed through peer training is that the most foreign concept to some people is the idea of listening to someone's story and the struggle that they may be experiencing without judgment and without trying to give advice firsthand, like just as a knee-jerk reaction. Because when we have often new students, I hesitate to call students because I'm technically their peer as well, and so calling them students would sort of, you know, denote some level of seniority in my rank. But when we have new members of the Resilience Peer Network, the first module is always about being a good listener, first and foremost. The second one then works on that and sort of develops skills about, you know, how to actually constructively respond in these situations. But listening always comes first, and it's important that in terms of mental health and mental health education, that when we try to talk about mental health on college campuses especially, we instill future peer supporters with the capacity to actively listen without judgment. But yeah, that's just sort of a tangent.
No, yeah. I think it's not a tangent. I mean, it's so important. And I think the history of how many of us have been taught to think about mental health is that, you know, you check off these boxes and you go here and this person helps you and then you go back to your life and nothing about your life changes. Nothing about how we support each other changes. And I know from my lived experience that just those things have never been enough. So I think any comprehensive campus mental health initiative has to, I think, incorporate things like what you all are doing.
Definitely.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I guess I'd like to take the last moment to ask I usually give two different options. So one is, what words of wisdom would you give to, I'll start with that. What words of wisdom would you give to someone interested in doing something similar to what you've done with Joelle?
I'd say don't be afraid of adapting. When I started out, I was definitely concerned that scaling back certain elements of my initial vision would be the same as really undercutting what I wanted to do. But now that I've actually, you know, built a team and managed to run a trial of Joelle, I realized that in a way, making compromises to your initial ideal isn't a terrible thing because it enables you to create what you wanted and work from there to create an even better version of your goal.
Thanks for sharing that. And I guess the other piece is anything that you would like to close with for people generally working on campus mental health, or maybe your younger self when you were getting started. So not just for folks who want to build a chat bot, but for, we all have, whether we identify as having a mental health condition or not, we all have different degrees of lived experience and are in this because we care. So I just wanted to open up for any closing ideas to maybe younger you or anybody just coming to school.
Or just another, I like thinking. And then, okay, I think I got it. My advice to anyone who's interested in starting their own mental health program, and in a way, my advice to my former self, who I was when I first entered UCLA, would be to have hope and maintain the conviction that things can change, and they will change when you direct your efforts towards them in a strategic and a continued manner. I think it's important to remember this because when you first start out as a leader of any sort of mental health initiative on campus, there will inevitably be pushback from admin or from, internally what you're trying to make in terms of your team, in terms of what you're building, in terms of just trying to get your program or your product off the ground. And I think it's very easy during these times to become disillusioned and to think that perhaps mental health, this mental health program shouldn't be done simply because it hasn't been done before or because it's just so incredibly difficult in the moment. To that, I would have to say, just accept that, especially for mental health programs, it's part of the process. And when you believe and you hope that the program that you're doing and what you're starting will make a difference, then you can keep going with it and it will exist. It will make a change. And whether or not that change is perfect from the start is uncertain, but it will exist if you make it so. And that's what I'd have to say to all future leaders and my former self.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for answering that. That was beautiful. And for sharing about all that you've done and all that. Really excited to hopefully check back in with you and find out more about what you find out with the relaunch of Joelle. And want to thank you again for being part of the council and for taking the time to talk today. And for folks who are interested, you'll be able to find more information about Kat and Joelle and our program in the report that'll be coming out alongside these interviews. So feel free to check that out. We'll also include the links to those for you to see directly. And thank you all for listening.